Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So today we will study the second lecture on international financial architecture. But actually I would like to speak to my students a special lecture on Friday at 9 a.m. Only those people who have had taken courses from me should come. This classroom might be too small, so we will arrange it in a larger room. Just a few pointers that I would like to say here is that we have only one life, and if you want to succeed, you have to give it everything that you have. You can't do a little bit here and a little bit there and waste your life. And the key thing that you need is knowledge. Knowledge is the most precious gift of God. The angels made sajda to Adam after he was given knowledge. Knowledge comes from struggle. That is giving everything you have. And one of the problems is that what comes in the way is idle desires, wasting time, watching TV, playing games. To some extent, this is needed, but you need to throw some bones to the dog, nafs, so that he can cooperate. But basically this nafs is you have to use, because that is the engine. You have to make yourself like things that you can change your desires. So understanding these things, now I am teaching you very precious, very valuable things which nobody knows. If you can understand them, they will be very valuable. But understanding does not come from listening to my lecture, but it comes from struggling with the material yourself. The real thing that would be useful is if I was to do question answers, but I don't have time. But this is something that you can do for yourselves. You should break up in small groups, go over the lecture, try to explain. I take the course. When I did the course, I did not know these things. I teach in order to learn. This book, Modern Monetary Theory, I had never read before. I would prepare the chapter before I came to class, and then I would try to understand it. And I would look up articles and look at references to see, and it would take me some time to understand. So basically, I struggle with, so I understood because I gave the lecture, but you didn't give the lecture. So you can divide into small groups and try to teach each other, and that would be very helpful. Alright, I think that's enough for now. Alright, so basically a review of the first lecture is that basically the First World War, up to the First World War, we had the colonial system. So this was the picture of the world around 1900, where nearly all countries except 4 or 5 in the whole world had been colonized by Europe. And basically they created spheres of influence. So Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas on 7th June 1494, 2 years after the fall of Islamic for Gibraltar in 1492, and they divided the world. After that, many other treaties were signed by people that, okay, you stay in this part and I'll stay in this part. So basically they were carving up the world and trying to make sure that they didn't conflict with each other. And although they were basically doing a loot and rape of the whole world, they called it the civilizing mission of the white man, or the white man's burden. So they were trying to civilize the barbarians that lived in the world by taking all their money away and killing them. So the thing is that, as we have seen, that capitalism requires profits for growth. If you can't have a stable equilibrium where the amount of money remains the same from one period to the next. The system is not designed like that. The system requires injections, and if you have a fixed amount of gold, then the money cannot be, the surplus that capitalism needs to survive cannot come from the inside, so it can only come from exploiting outside. That's why the Europeans spread all over the world looking for gold, because gold was the only money. They went to Latin America and they asked for gold, and when they couldn't find gold, they took slaves. So by 1900, you see, as they completed the conquest of the globe, and there was no more surplus left. So now if you have a static economy and you have a gold standard and you have a economy that is closed, then you run into trouble. The only possible way to expand is to conquer others. Now, up until that time, they had partitioned the world into spheres of influence. I'll conquer X and you conquer Y, but now when the whole world is finished, then you can only fight each other. So while you had these colonies, they were isolated. There was most of the trade took place within the colonies. There was the mother country, and then there were the colonies, and basically the colonies sent raw materials to the mother country, and the country sent manufactured goods back to the colonies, and they invented this theory of comparative advantage, which they used to fool the people that, okay, the comparative advantage of the colonies lies in the production of raw materials, and the comparative advantage of the mother country lies in the industrial products. So you stay deindustrialized and we will do the industrial manufacturing. This theory is completely bogus and silly. Any country can develop an industry, and if you look at the East Asian, they developed lots of industries from scratch where they didn't have any comparative advantage. So it's ridiculous. The strange thing is that keeps being taught even today. So for the initial period, everything was within colonies, so the problems with money did not matter, because there was only one country which had gold, and they could actually cheapen the gold backing, or they could do fractional reserve. They could print any amount of money and it wouldn't cause any serious problems. But after the whole world was conquered, then gradually the trade between the European countries, each with their different colonial systems, started to increase. That's the only way to go after the possibilities are exhausted within the colonies. So now when you get into international trade, then you have a serious problem with the gold, that if you keep the gold content fixed, then you cannot supply enough money to your domestic economy, and if you dilute your gold, that is, you print more money, then you get into trouble with the foreign trade, because the foreign trade, the value of your currency changes. And so this is the basic dilemma, that do we keep the currency stable by fixing the gold content, and then we make sure that our foreign trade is solid and stable and fixed exchange rate, or but that comes at the cost of starving the domestic economy of money. So you have to choose between global trade and between a domestic economy. For initially, everybody went for the domestic economy, but later, as the foreign trade became more important, the elite, the financiers, the top classes, they were much more in favor of foreign trade, and they did not care too much about the domestic economy, because if you have a large amount of unemployment, it's only the poor who suffer. So basically the choices were made to keep the gold standard strong and solid, and let the domestic economy suffer from high unemployment. So part 1 of the talk gave some history of the gold standard, colonization and globalization. So colonization took place first, and then after the world got conquered, then globalization took place. There was lots of trade between the European countries. And now the Keynesian theory, I mean exactly what I have described, that money has to be available in the right quantities exactly for the needs of the domestic economy. But the needs of the domestic economy are rather different from the needs of international trade. And that was the serious problem with the gold standard. One more problem that arises with the fractional reserve money system, which was in use, is called pro-cyclical money creation. This has to do with Minsky. Basically, in fractional reserve system, when the business is booming, then the private sector has a lot of incentive to create lots of money because you can get returns. And this is exactly the opposite of what is needed by the economy. Once you are running at full capacity, you should restrict the money supply to prevent inflation. And similarly, when the economy is going to recession, then you need to expand the money supply, but the private sector actually does the opposite. So it makes the booms more boomy and the busts more deep. And this is what leads to business cycles. As the globalization takes place and as these tensions between domestic economy needs and global trade increased, see, some people think of the whole thing as just a game of money. So if you want to explain World War I in terms of money, you can do that. And basically the tensions were due to the conflicts between the requirements of domestic economy and the requirements of global trade, and eventually this led to a war. And in the war, you had the treasuries, the central banks had to spend a lot of gold to finance the war, and this led to basically both US and UK suspended the gold standard. They could not redeem the currency for gold anymore. And post-World War, things were in a mess. So it was not easy to restore the gold standard. And I think in the first part of the lecture, we discussed about the efforts to restore the gold standard and how they failed. Now in part 2, it's I go through the Ragnar Nurske paper on what happened after the World War I and why efforts to restore the gold standard failed. And reading this paper carefully and trying to understand it will give you a lot of insight into how monetary policy works, even though this is a bit obsolete in the sense that we don't have the gold standard anymore, but many of the lessons that you learn from that, in particular how the central bank behavior matters, this is valid today as well. So the first, these are the topics. I think we have, this is the paper. Try to read the paper yourself. So basically he looks at the trilemma. We have already discussed that. You see, when I say about the needs of domestic economy in the global trade, this assumes free capital flows. If we put in capital controls, then you can expand the money supply in the domestic economy, as long as that doesn't spill over automatically to the demand for imports. Then there will be no problem. If you restrict, if you say, okay, only a small portion of the money in the economy can be used for imports, and that will be controlled by licensing or by many other mechanisms, then there is no conflict. You use a different standard for foreign trade. So, but there was free exchange of capital. So once you have that, then there is a conflict between. Now, before I taught this course, my own view was that you need fixed exchange rates and domestic monetary policy, and you should impose capital controls. But the MMT point of view is that you should have floating exchange rates and domestic monetary policy, and you can let go of capital controls. And there is some merit to this point of view. Basically, if you try to control the exchange rate, you make mistakes, and these mistakes are costly. So if it's better to allow the market equilibrium, this has the immediate disadvantage that things are not predictable. But basically, what MMTers say, and I now agree with this, is that the market will devise mechanisms. It's not that these things are not in existence right now. This is the problem. The current setter, and international trade needs to be played by rules which are artificial. The artificial rules which were devised were IMF and World Bank post World War II. IMF was designed for a world of fixed exchange rates, and that's the mindset. Although IMF has moved and they now recommend floating exchange rates, but they are not designed to deal with the problems that emerge due to floating exchange rates. And so that's what you need. You need new types of institutions which allow floating exchange rates, but allow the traders to make trades in imports and exports in long run basis at prices which they can know in advance. And there are many ways you can do that. There are forward exchanges, and there are many different mechanisms. But these mechanisms are not in place right now. The world is not set up to deal with floating exchange rates in the best possible way. So the first point of Ragnar Nurske is that the pre-war central bank behavior was different from the post-war central bank behavior. So he said that there was a decline of confidence in central banks. In pre-World War I period, central banks were committed to maintain the exchange rate, which included often sacrificing the domestic economy to do so. But in the post-war period, things were pretty bad. The domestic economies were in bad shape. So now this trade-off was no longer so easy for them to make, because everybody was hurting, not just the poor. So there were many situations where, for example, the Bank of England, in order to protect the value of the pound in the foreign currency market, it was needed for it to raise the interest rate. But if it raised the interest rate, that would hurt the domestic economy. So in this particular case, it did not do so. And similarly, post-war in 1930s, I think the Bank of England announced that it was going back on the gold standard, but it set the value a little bit too high, and Keynes said that this is not the right equilibrium and you have set it too high. But they did it anyway, and then in order to protect the value of the pound, they had to raise the interest rate. That caused a disparity between the British pound and the US dollar, and money started flowing in, and dollar was weakening. So dollar was required to raise the interest rate, and I think they did try to protect the pound by raising the interest rate, but then they found that they couldn't. And so basically it's a very complex and sensitive and delicate balancing mechanism if you're trying to maintain fixed exchange rates. And so then everybody has to balance things. And this is what happened in the European Union as well. They have said that your deficits should be controlled and your interest rates should match, and so that they can have one currency, because otherwise but things are not working out. And actually people don't know very much about the mechanism. I mean, today the newspaper headline read that Imran Khan is going to go after the tax evaders. Now the thing is that taxation is this is a good thing for corruption control, but the mindset of the government is that we need to raise taxes and we need to collect taxes so as to fund our expenditures. And this is not true. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't have any taxes because basically the government currently is running on a certain amount of money. If you say, let's say, okay, from tomorrow there's will be no taxes. So taxes is a fairly big chunk of the economy. It's about 12% of the 12% of GDP or 15%, I don't remember. So suddenly you will have 12% more money in the economy, and what will happen? And this is not just a one-time shot. This is taxation is an annual process. This is a flow. So you will have 12% additional aggregate demand, and this is going to create 12% inflation in prices because you have done nothing else. So taxation is needed, but it is needed to choke the aggregate demand to prevent inflation. It's not needed to collect revenue to pay for the government expenses. So if you have that understanding, then you can do taxes in a very different way from how it is being done today. All right, so so basically Nurske says that prior to World War I, we had stabilizing capital flows. If the dollar was weakening in the international market, then people would were confident that and you suppose that lots of dollar is flowing out. People are buying, Americans are buying foreign goods, dollars are flowing out. Then if there is an imbalance of trade, dollars are accumulating in the hands of others, then the central bank needs to take a step to make dollars more attractive, and the natural thing to do is to raise the interest rate on dollars. So anticipating that the central bank is going to take steps, people will, by raising the interest, people will start buying dollars in advance. And so this would be a stabilizing capital flow because it would move against the current. But in the situation, in the pre-war situation, but post-war, the central bank might not move to protect the dollar. So the dollar, actually the exchange rate, once you see that there's a lot of dollar flowing out, you think that maybe what will happen is the central bank will devalue the dollar. So then you say, oh, I better move my dollar out first before the central bank devalues. So now this is a destabilizing capital flow. You put more into the direction in which you have weakness. So post-war World War, because central bank behavior changed, so the public behavior also changed, and the capital flows became destabilizing instead of stabilizing. So they were basically what Nurske says is that either what we need to do is to allow greater exchange rate flexibility, or we can have monetary union, or actually the third option, which is not mentioned, is that you can just do what? Restrict capital flows. You prevent, and this is what actually East Asia, in Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad did. He said that he temporarily banned the convertibility of the ringgit in the crisis, and that helped to overcome the crisis. So Nurske, no, this is not Nurske, somebody else gave the example that in 1990s, maybe it was after the global financial crisis, yes. The euro was weakening, and there was some specific reason which I have forgotten. And so there was panic in the markets, and then finally Mario Draghi announced that we will do whatever it takes to defend the euro. And suddenly, once he announced that we are going to take steps to make sure that the value of euro will not decline, and suddenly the markets became calm, and the capital flows actually reversed direction. People who were selling euros to get out in the possibility that this will the rate will decline, they started buying euros again because they had confidence because the central bank can do whatever it takes. This is also one more important thing, but also central bank credibility is very important, and that's one of the important lessons of monetary policy, that basically if the central bank can control expectations, then they can handle monetary policy. That's why and of course expectations is not so easy to handle. So the second lesson from Nurske is that when you try to defend the peg, you have this is the standard in the interwar period. The idea was that okay, there was no gold backing, but we will maintain a peg, a fixed exchange rate, and that was agreement between the banks that okay, we will trade at this pegged exchange rate. Now efforts to defend the peg may be worse than futile when the central bank lacks the credibility that we just discussed. So does anybody understand this? You have read the lecture, so can somebody explain this phenomena? Why is it that when you try to defend the peg, this might actually be counterproductive, according to Nurske? Anybody have any idea? Yes.
सर जो मार्केट एक्सपेक्टेशंस अपोजिट साइड पे जा रही होती है और जब स्टेट या सेंट्रल बैंक जो है वो डिफेंड करने की कोशिश करता है बैंक के लिए हमारी जो वैल्यू है ये इसी पर रेजिस्टेंट है, लेकिन जो मार्केट सिग्नल्स है वो अपोजिट डायरेक्शन पे जा रहे होते हैं, तो जो कॉमन पब्लिक है दे बिलीव कि हमें विफूल किया जा रहा है और करेंसी एक्चुअली हमारी वीक हो रही है, लेकिन हमें बताया जा रहा है कि ये सिचुएशन ठीक है. इस तरह से ये रादर देन बिलीविंग इट वो इससे और ड्रिफ्ट अवे हो जाता है.
Correct, yes. See, this is very important to understand. One of the things that the lessons that you need to know is that the surface facts are never the full story. So you have to develop an inquisitive mind. You have to understand what lies beneath the surface, and it will never be written in the books of history. You have to study, you have to try to understand what is happening rather than learn the facts. And this is something which is not taught. Ibn Khaldun was a book about history. The main contribution was, for the first time, he tried to find out the deeper causes of large historical shifts. So, for example, he said that civilizations grow and they age and they become enveloped in luxury, and then new barbarians come along and they are young and energetic and they attack and destroy, and the old. So this is a pattern which is a centuries pattern in history. So he was able to look at, isolated events. This happened, this happened, this happened, and pick up something deep which is beneath the surface, which is not at all obvious from looking at the sequence of facts. So this is what you have to learn. Learn to look beneath the surface. And this is not something which is taught. So this is something that you have to understand. So here, the Nurske is saying that balance of payments fluctuates at random. Sometimes you have high exports, sometimes you have low exports. It's just market variations. But suppose that the bank misreads the signal and says, okay, maybe we have too much outflow of pounds. A random fluctuation has happened, but maybe a random large fluctuation can happen. So it says, okay, let's just raise the interest rate to protect the pound. Now, the public doesn't have access to all of the data as to what's happening, but it sees that the central bank has made a move to protect the pound. So so they say that they think that, oh, this is a sign that the pound is weakening. That's why they're trying to protect it. Now the question is, so they see two signals. One is a signal that there's a pound is weakening, and the other signal is that the central bank is trying to protect it. Now they know that the central bank is not fully committed. If the weakening worsens, then the bank will drop protection. So they don't know whether they can trust the bank or whether they should just transfer their money out to make sure that so now this gives a signal. So the raising the interest rate to protect the pound might actually weaken the pound, and fall in exchange rate also might gives a similar signal. That's why that, okay, the rupee is weakening and it might weaken even further. So there is a well-known phenomena of overshooting. Once a currency falls, then it always falls to substantially below the actual equilibrium before confidence is restored. So you have seen this overshooting in the rupee dollar exchange market quite often recently, and that is also why I explained to you, there was a meeting, highest level meeting, fiscal and monetary policy coordination board in December, middle of December, and everybody said that yes, we agree, balance of payment problem is over, the money, the treaties have been signed, money will start flowing in January, and we will not have any further need to devalue. So we said, there was a debate, should we announce this? So if we announce this, how will the public interpret this? Will the public interpret this as a signal that things are really bad and we are trying to bolster confidence of the public, and so it might have the opposite effect of the intended? So we decided not to make that announcement because of this possibility. We said that, look, there has to be, just the announcement is not enough. There has to be some other signal, like if we basically, what was said is that, look, the foreign exchange reserves, they are declining day by day, and people know the reserve situation. So while the reserves are declining and we make this announcement, it will seem like we are in a real panic situation, and we're trying to make we're trying to bolster the confidence to save reserves. So we said, okay, we'll make the announcement once the reserves stabilize and they start going up, then it is positioned. And so recently this happened, and the governor of the state bank made the statement that things are now stable and we are out of crisis situation, and there's no expectation that there will be a balance of payment crisis. So this is how delicate the market is in terms of management of expectations. So I have written somewhere about how the George Soros broke the Bank of England by gambling against them. he put in $6 billion. This is a good story to read. You should. Okay, so we discussed the trilemma already, so I won't discuss it again. So basically Nurske says that interwar system broke down because central bank failure to play by the rules, where the rules were the pre-war rules, he means. So pre-war rules were that if the basically if you lose dollars, people are buying, then you allow the foreigners, what this does is if this changes the money supply in the domestic market, and either the money supply goes down or it goes up depending on whether you have inflows or outflows. So this is if you have outflows, then the domestic economy is adversely affected. Basically, when you purchase imports, that's a leakage from the domestic demand. That's money that's going for aggregate demand of foreign goods and being lost to the domestic economy as aggregate demand. Sure, domestic aggregate demand goes down, aggregate demand for foreign goods go up, so it has a impact on the exchange rate. It throws your economy into recession, it creates expansion on the outside. So now, if you have a recession, this will cause a restriction in your aggregate demand. It will cause a reduction in your demand for imports, and so this will be stabilizing effect. This is not the Hume species flow mechanism, but it is like that in the sense that if you allow gold to flow out, when you spend a lot of dollars outside, and then those dollars are cash for gold, gold will flow out of the country. When the gold flows out of the country, the gold backing of your dollar will go down, and the value of the dollar will go down, and it will correct. This is not actually how things work, but now suppose that instead you do what is called sterilization of the capital flows. So if your money is flowing out, you have lots of imports, your money supply and your domestic demand is weakening, so the aggregate demand the central bank can pump money into the economy to make up for the lost money and keep the aggregate demand stable, preventing a recession in your economy. But when that happens, then then you don't have stabilization anymore. Now, if people are buying using dollars to buy foreign goods, they will keep buying dollars because the central bank will provide them with the loss that is taking place on the domestic economy will not suffer. So ultimately this will lead to a balance of payments disequilibrium. So he gave evidence for this, Nurske, and this is the thing that you need to learn. You can say anything you like, but you have to give empirical evidence for this. Anisa is one of my students from past, and she said that she was being interviewed recently at ComSat. So they asked her, "What did you learn?" So she says, "It's very difficult to say." Have you heard of the Asad Zaman school of thought? So I said that, you shouldn't advertise this. It's very difficult. But she said that no. So he said, "Okay, tell us something." She said that, we were taught that there is money illusion in the labor market. She said, "No, give us some evidence." So she said, "Look, in the Bank of England there was a coal miners' strike when they cut the wages, but when by 10%, but when the inflation occurred by 10%, they didn't do anything." He said, "Yes, that makes sense." So when you have, she said that when you provide evidence for your views, if you just make tall claims that it's like this, it's like that, but you don't have any empirical evidence, then you will get shot down. So you have to have the evidence. So Nurske is providing here evidence for this. He's saying that in the pre-war period, when you look at the domestic assets of the central bank, the reserves, and the foreign assets, they move in opposite directions post-war. So, in the and that's sterilization. Sterilization happens when you have foreign money is coming in. That expands your money supply, because that expands the aggregate demand. Because foreign money is coming in means that you are exporting more, so your aggregate demand is the foreigners add to your aggregate demand. So now that would overheat the economy. So the central bank sterilizes by reducing the domestic assets. So sterilization occurs by when foreign central bank domestic assets and foreign assets move in opposite directions. And if you don't stabilize, then they will move in the same direction. So if he looked at Nurske looked at data on capital flows, and he showed this pattern that pre-war you did not have sterilization, so capital assets and domestic assets, foreign assets were not correlated. They both moved in the same directions. But in the post-war period, you had opposite direction. So somebody by the name of Bloomfield went and looked at the data, and he said that no, we find the same pattern of sterilization in the pre-war period. This Nurske theory is wrong. So this is where the real battle is, that you have to, anybody can spin any kind of theory that you like, and this is what happens in your typical PhD theses, that people pick up a regression, they run a regression, and then they start telling stories about why I wonder if you have seen my paper on or my talk on regressions, in which I show that the gender ratio difference between female pay and maybe it's the difference between female life expectancy and GDP, something like that, exactly. There's a very strong relationship. So now you can make up a whole story about how when women live longer, then they contribute heavily to the economy, because, and so on and so forth. So this is your 90% of your PhD thesis. They just run these regressions and then they tell these stories which are meaningless. You have to learn to be deeper than that. So now Bloomfield showed that there is the same pattern in pre-war data. So Pippinger comes in and says that if you look at what's really happening in the pre-war period, banks were sterilizing in the short run to prevent short run fluctuations, but in the long run they protected the exchange rate. And so if you look at the short run immediate reaction, if there was a large flow in of foreign capital, the banks would sterilize that, but in the long run they would accommodate and they would make sure that the exchange rate. So this resolves the controversy. There was a fourth factor mentioned by Nurske, that there was strong deflationary pressure. Why was that? Why is there strong deflationary pressure on central banks in the post-war period? Post-World War I. Yes. Take a shot.
there can also be, especially in the more industrialized economy, they have a very strong weapons industry. Its demand all of a sudden went down after the post-World War period.
No, it's just low global supplies of gold. The central banks did not have enough gold to back their currencies. So what they could have done, what they should have done, was to say that okay, instead of saying that okay, the $1 is backed by $22 is worth 1 ounce of gold. So from now on, it will be $44. That would have worked. We have to readjust to a new equilibrium level. But this is something that needed to be done in a coordinated way across the world, that all of the central banks in the world get together and say that now we are going to just half the gold content. Then the amount of gold that would have been done. But there was no coordination. There was no international agency which could arrange this. So now, if one currency does it, okay, then suddenly all of the global trade rules change. So suddenly, for example, the U.S. goods would become twice as cheap. There's a half-price sale on all U.S. goods if the U.S. cuts for foreigners. So there would be a huge exogenous hit on demand. This would cause dramatic differences in cause massive changes in the structure of the economy. The exchange rate is a silent killer. You don't today. The more I have been studying, the more I've realized that for the past 30 years we have had an overvalued exchange rate, and this has really destroyed the economy. And you can look at many things. Why are our exports low? And you look at X, Y, and Z, and people have been looking at X, Y, and Z, and they haven't been because that our industry is not competitive, and we are doing this, and we have bureaucracy, and we have corruption, and we have blah, and we have blah. But nobody thinks about the possibility that the rupee is overvalued. And yet the evidence for this is so strong. If you can import tomatoes from India, then it means that your currency is overvalued. And actually, lots of farmers say that it's not worth it for us to grow crops because we can't sell them, we can't get the price for them. And this is when Pakistan is a now food shortage country. We import about billions of dollars worth of food. Why should an agricultural country be importing food? It should not be importing food. But if the rupee is overvalued, then we can cheaply buy food from outside. We can buy milk from Australia and cheese from Switzerland, and we are seeing these things in our supermarkets. Should not be possible if the price was, and it's not too much more expensive than the domestic milk. It's really very strange. If it was double the price or triple the price, then we would say, okay. So that was the problem, that what was needed was a coordinated reduction in gold content of all the currencies. Then domestically, it doesn't matter whether your gold backing doesn't matter at all domestically. So you can say that, okay, previously we had $22 to the ounce, now we have $50 to the ounce. No difference at all on domestic economy. But if international economy, if everybody else doesn't do that, then there's a massive impact in terms of your imports all becoming very expensive. A whole collection of businesses that were based on importing things and manufacturing, they would just all collapse. And a whole new set of businesses which were not feasible to run, these would be import substitution businesses. Things which are very expensive to import now, you can manufacture. Previously, when the imports were cheap, it was not possible to manufacture them. And this is the problem, that Pakistan has tried import substitution unsuccessfully for decades, and other countries have succeeded. So the lesson that our policy makers have learned is that import substitution doesn't work. We should do export promotion, even though and they have been doing export promotion. That has not worked either. So, because coordinated change was not possible, people were also, there was this, this is the important thing, that you see, economists only look at data. But what really drives the history is the dreams and the ambitions of people. The war was done because of people had wrong ideas. And economies are run on the basis of wrong macroeconomic ideas. Today we are going to have high tax drive, we are going to have corruption drives, and these are not the things that matter. And these are not the things that make a difference. There are other things which make a difference, but because we have wrong theories in our head, we are going to, you see, anything that you do, an action that you take today, depends on your theory about how this action will impact on the future. So our theories about how the world behaves are extremely important. Extremely important. So we have theories about this is what we need to do in order to make progress. This theory, which may be true, which may be false, which may be irrelevant, determines your action. So it's very important to have the right theory, and that's what knowledge is. Knowing the right theory, or knowing that we do not know, this is also very important, because then if you don't know, then there are other ways that you behave. But if you believe in the wrong theories, then you are in big trouble. So, what the people after World War I believed, that we had huge amounts of prosperity in the pre-war period, and this war destroyed. Let's somehow just turn back the clock. Let's somehow get back to and what were the things that were there in the pre-war era? We had gold standard. So they thought that the gold standard was the reason why we had prosperity. So let's get back to the gold standard. Everybody believed it, including those people. Basically, as I said, the gold standard was harmful for the masses and helpful for the elites. But everybody was agreed that let's go back to the gold standard, because they didn't understand that this gold standard is good for some and bad for others. And they attributed the general prosperity of the pre-war period to the gold standard. And then everybody was miserable in the post-war period, so they said, okay, whatever the situation was pre-war, it was better then. So they were an effort to turn back the clock. People tried to restore the gold standard. People tried to put the parity back at where it was before the war, which was a very stupid thing to do. And Keynes said, even the Bank of England set it at the wrong value. So there was a deflationary pressure because the banks wanted to set the parity to pre-war periods or close to pre-war periods, because they wanted to show that our economy, we have recovered. So this is again a signaling problem. We are now just as strong as we were before the war. They thought that to reduce the gold content would signal weakness in the economy. Well, yes, all economies had become weakened, but they wanted to. One of the factors that they took into account was that we want to maintain confidence of the public, so we don't want to make drastic moves. Like at the monetary policy decision, the model said that you should go for a 2% interest hike. But everybody agreed that if we did that, people would say that there is a panic, and that so we should not impose all of that change in one move, and we should go gradually, because people should not get the impression that the central bank is panicking and trying to control a crisis that will create a crisis. So the now when you try to fix the gold at the parity that pre-war and you don't have enough gold, this will create deflationary pressure in the sense that you can't print too much money. I mean, you have to maintain a certain proportion of reserves in order to print money, and if you have very little reserves, then you can only print very little money. And so that is another solution. If you reduce all the prices, then suppose you halve all the prices of everything in your country, then the same amount of gold is good. You have basically doubled your money supply, and that is what was that would have been a solution, except for devaluation. Deflation causes a lot of different problems, which you can see. Basically, what was needed was global deflation, but it needs to be done coordinatedly. If one country deflates once and the other one follows, there's lots of problems. Any problems happen. For example, suppose the US unilaterally says that, okay, I'm going to devalue the dollar by doubling the the gold to dollar to gold ratio. Now, suddenly, a lot of industries have become loss industries because the imports are too expensive, and suddenly there's room for creating import substitution industries, but you will create them only if you know that that this is a stable pattern for the future. Now, what will happen when you do that is that some countries will see, oh, look, we are our people are just buying everything from the USA, and suddenly there's this huge leak that has emerged in our domestic aggregate demand. So now what should we do? We need to protect our economy, and there are many ways. One is to print more money, but the other way is to just devalue our currency so that the parity is restored. And so that is a natural reaction, so that people don't the balance of trade doesn't shift too heavily in favor of dollars. So they also devalue. So suppose that so it depends on how long it takes, but the person who is starting the import substitution industry cannot count on this situation persisting forever, because he might say that, well, temporarily this will be profitable, but I don't want to put in too much investment in this, because who knows what will happen in the future. So there were these asymmetric shocks in the balance of payments. That is, everybody was trying to manage their domestic economy, and stability of the exchange rate was no one's major concern. So so there were these random shocks going on, sometimes big, sometimes small, as everybody was trying to run their own economy. And yet this erratic pattern of exchange rate led to volatile capital flows. People were trying to look at the configuration and trying to maximize their benefits. So there are these big finance, and this is really the serious problem, that hot capital flows. You need to get rid of these Rothschilds and people who are speculating with gold and trying to move the money to wherever it will earn the higher interest. So actually, eliminating speculative capital flows would be of tremendous value for global economy, but this can be done because the financiers, the ones with the gold, are running the world today. So another point of the Nurske paper was that banks would acquire gold reserves in order to show that our currency is backed, but they could not use the reserves. So reserves were immobilized. This is a very strange phenomenon. Why were reserves immobilized?
Because too much change in reserves would be deemed as something negative.
Exactly. If your reserves started to go down, this would be taken as a signal that the currency is weakening. So, if you have your reserves to back your currency and you use them to protect your currency, then suddenly the signal will say, "Oh, then this basically there's big players in the market, and Soros can bring in 6 billion. Oh, the Bank of England reserves are going down, the currency is weakening. I will speculate against the pound," and he bought billions of dollars of pound in the forward market at cheap rates, and this basically became a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, even though you have reserves, you can't use them, because if you use them, it is taken as a signal of weakness, and this creates a much stronger attack. What in the pre-war period, what they used to do in such situations was to temporarily suspend gold payments. That okay, we won't pay in gold because temporarily there has been an excess, and things would go back to equilibrium, and there would be no problems. Balance of keeps fluctuating at random, and at this time we are suspending gold payments. Okay, no problem, because everybody knew that in the pre-war period, banks are committed to a fixed exchange rate, and they will eventually start making gold payments at the same rate. But in the post-war period, if the central bank would say that okay, we are temporarily short of reserves, so we will suspend gold payments, this was taken as a signal of weakness, and this would create massive run on the market, and it would have the opposite effect. We have the same kind of thing. Now I remember, I think the Nurske paper is analyzed by some other paper, and so they have put in some now I remember. So they have put in some the author of the new paper who analyzes the Nurske paper says, how well do these lessons hold up for today? So he says that we have similar phenomena occurring today. In 2008, when there was a run on the Bank of Korea, they had $200 billion of reserves. They didn't have really any problem in managing the crisis, but they didn't want the reserves to fall below 200 billion because they thought that this would create a run in the international markets. Similarly, in a similar situation, the Bank of China protected its reserves and it did not use them. So there was a dilemma that you can't use reserves when you need them the most. When you are in a crisis, you want to use your reserves, but if you use your reserves and they start going down, people take it as a signal of a bigger crisis. So there is a solution that you can do currency swaps, which basically involves allowing people to instead of paying in dollars, China can pay us in rupees and we can pay China in yuan. That way we don't have to use dollar reserves. And IMF can also come in and provide credits which would add to your reserves. And this is actually what the role of the IMF was designed to be, to provide temporary. Basically, that was the idea of the IMF, that there will be these temporary balance of payment movements, and the IMF will step in to make sure that these do not get converted into long-run problems. But it has not been functioning very well. There is the sixth problem that Nurske mentioned is that there is no mechanism for international liquidity. So what does that mean? Basically, in the post, that is the problem that we had. What needed to be done was that in the post-war period was that either basically the world needed to double the quantity of gold. Now this can be done easily. Everybody says that from now on our currencies are worth half of what they were previous to the war in terms of gold. This would have been beautiful. No problems in international trade, no problems in domestic economy. It would have just worked perfectly. But there was no mechanism for this. There was no mechanism to control international liquidity. It could not be done piecemeal, one country at a time. This is what people tried to do and didn't work very well. And this is what also created the fear of floating. In fact, this is very important, that in the international markets, when basically the new equilibrium was very far away, everybody tried to do it piecemeal, so there were floating exchange rates, and this caused a lot of erratic balance of payments crises, random movements of capital, and this is why in the post-World War II period, everybody has been afraid of allowing currencies to freely float. So there's a psychological problem. As I said, economists don't believe much or don't think much about psychology of people, but basically the global financial crisis was predicted by behavioral economists, but not by standard DSGE theorists. All of the standard macro models failed to predict the global financial crisis because they do not take into account the psychology of human behavior. So if you want to understand what's going on in the economy, it seems very strange that you have these massive amounts of gold and machinery and factories. How can human psychology make any difference in this? But it makes a massive amount of difference. As you have the whole lecture has been about psychology. When Mario Draghi comes and announces that I'm going to defend the pound is safe. When the central bank makes the wrong signal, it causes a crisis. So it's all about human psychology. Now, it should not be like that. It should not be like that. It's actually hot capital flows which are causing this problem. And if we followed Islamic laws and we prevented speculation in currency, this problem would not happen. But today the world is run by people who have gold in huge amounts, and they are just destabilizing the global economy. So how can suppose just like you have needs of domestic economy, you have needs of the global economy. Suppose you want to increase and that's what happened post-World War. The global economy needed more money. So there should be a mechanism for this. And that was the job of the IMF. The special drawing rights were meant to be an additional currency for use to increase global liquidity. That didn't happen. What happened was that the dollar started being used, and the dollar used led to the Triffin dilemma, which is similar to the Trilemma but different. There is Triffin's problem or Triffin's paradox. Basically, when you start using dollar as the reserve currency, then international liquidity is controlled by the quantity of dollars. Now the US has responsibility, this is what Triffin wrote, as the world reserve currency to make sure that there's enough money in the global economy to make sure that there's no depression. But the US also has its own domestic economy to worry about. So if the needs of the two conflict, as they will often do, then suppose for example the international economy needs a lot more dollars, but the domestic economy will run into inflation if you print a lot of dollars. Then that's Triffin's dilemma, that should the US central bank, the Federal Reserve, look after the needs of the domestic economy, or should it look after the needs of the global economy? And this is always going to be true? This is because the mechanism that we have for international liquidity is just a bad mechanism. We need to create a better mechanism, and there is a lot of effort taking place under the tables, because anything that you do, you see, if you announce that this is going to happen, it's going to have massive impact on the global financial markets, and there's lots of people who are looking for every signal and trying to move large amounts, billions of dollars, to take advantage. So even when you're thinking out loud, you have to be careful about making sure that your thoughts are not acted upon. So there's lots of planning for changing the global financial architecture, but mostly it's being done in secret. So same type of problems. This is in the 60s. The US, the global economy required devaluation of the dollar so as to allow more money in the global economy, but the US did not want to devalue because it would cause problems for the domestic economy. It would the mechanism that was designed was written into the Bretton Woods Agreement was that devaluations would require pre-approval by IMF. That way the IMF could coordinate changes across the economy, make sure that they are all in sync. But this was never done. Nobody ever asked for approval. IMF was supposed to issue SDRs for this purpose of keeping stability in the global economy, making sure smoothing them, but they were never issued in the quantity that was required to manage the global economy. The SDRs are there, but they are there in very small amounts. If you want to manage the global economy, you need to have a huge number of SDRs flowing in and out, and it could have been done, but basically that would have transferred the, just like the European Central Bank controls the money supply in Europe, so the IMF would have controlled the money supply in the globe. Now, currently the Federal Reserve Bank does so, and the IMF is a genuinely multinational body, and there are other players in the game. So although it is true that IMF, the US is a big player, not everything at IMF happens by US orders, although a lot of things happen by US orders. So the US prefers things this way. So instead of, so after the Nixon shock, when the Nixon removed gold backing for the dollar, then they made sure in the 70s that the dollar would retain global value by tying it to petroleum, and they went and made deals with the OPEC countries that to make sure that all trading of oil was done in dollars, and that ensured that dollar retains its value even though it is not backed by gold. So now when Pakistan buys gold from Saudi, they have to pay in dollars. Recently they have changed this, but okay, so one of the problems is pro-cyclical. So just like the domestic economy creates pro-cyclical liquidity, so also the global economy creates pro-cyclical liquidity, which is a very bad thing. Now, these RBC models, they don't, and this is exactly, and what I'm saying is exactly the opposite of what the RBC model says. In fact, that's a very useful way to think. The RBC model says that business cycles occur due to real factors, and people's thoughts are not real factors. But even more than that, money is not a real factor. So that's even worse. So then the RBC model cannot explain the business cycle. RBC model explains the business cycle by these random shocks which nobody knows where they came from, and these are the things. Basically, if you have a stable system and you shock it, it can go into disequilibrium temporarily, and then it will move back to disequilibrium. So the picture of the RBC is that it's like it's a ball sitting inside a bowl. It receives shocks from time to time, so it moves away and then it moves back, and that's what business cycles are. When I was studying in Stanford, we were taught business cycle theory, so they taught us a couple of differential equations, and basically if you have a 2x2 system of differential equation and it has complex roots, then you get cycles. So this is the explanation of business cycles, that the business cycle occurs because the economic system is described by differential equations with complex roots. This is completely ridiculous. This is exactly what I mean by this is what is being taught all over the world today. Just complete garbage and nonsense. So when people are taught this kind of nonsense, then they think that economies cannot be understood. So we have just been working on how we can understand economics, and it's not that much of a rocket science if you look at what's happening. So basically, pro-cyclical liquidity creation happens. This is completely outside the ambit of RBC models. Unfortunately, most models being used in central banks, including in ours, are based on these DSGE models. DSGE model is an RBC model which has been sort of so basically, how does monetary policy work? It works through a monetary policy shock. So that's how instead of building money in as an integral part of the economy, the random fluctuations in money happen and they cause these things to happen, the other things to happen. So basically we are in very bad shape. Actually, I just wrote to the authors of this textbook that, do you have a MMT model? So it turns out that there does not exist one. They said this is on the agenda. So I think this is one of the prime orders of the day, to create an alternative to the DSG model based on MMT ideas, which would work much better. So post-war there were multiple reserve centers. Anybody who had gold was a reserve center, so any currency which had lots of gold. So there was lots of hopping of currencies. This is what caused hot capital flows, as there was this dream that global financial system has become very unstable. Somehow, if we could just get back to the pre-war period. And so there was lots of effort to go back, and even the IMF and the World Bank represent efforts to maintain stable exchange rates without gold. That was the hope, and it could have been done, but it would have required giving a lot more power to the IMF, and that was politically impossible. If IMF had a lot of power, and if they could print SDRs very, very easily, and then they could stabilize capital flows, and they could do everything that was in their mandate, but it would require giving too much power to the IMF, which was not politically possible. So Eichengreen, who is writing, okay, so this is the Eichengreen paper about Nurske paper that I am discussing. So he says that multipolar system came into existence, it was highly unstable. Today we are facing the same problem, that the multipolar system is going to come into existence because China has now become the leading trading economy, so renminbi has to become currency which is going to be one of the world currencies. So now we will have dollars, euros, renminbi, maybe some others, and so this is going to be a multipolar system. So he says that people are afraid that this will lead to the same type of instability, but he says that this is not a valid fear. You can have stable multipolar systems. It requires different types of rules from the center country has special responsibility. This is the Triffin dilemma, which I just talked about. Now, this is something which has many people have said that, okay, if we deflate, this should improve our exports and decrease our imports. But very often these expected results don't materialize, at least in the short run. So when you have balance of payment deficit, then the exchange rate cannot quickly equilibrate this. Many of our imports are fixed, inelastic, regardless of what the exchange rate is, we're going to import them. And similarly, our exports cannot quickly change because there's no excess capacity in the export sector. If we have a long period in which we maintain exchange rates at a high period, then the capacity will develop over time. But this requires stable exchange rates for a long period of time, which is hard. So now, how should we design a new system? Well, basically, one of the things is that current system puts the pressure to adjust on the country which is running the deficit. We are losing exchanges and we must do something. Actually, the Keynes designed the system so that it would be symmetric. The country which was gaining the reserves would also be under pressure, and that sort of evens the balance. And this is the kind of system that is needed. Basically, he recommended that we put a tax on surplus reserves. Everybody should keep the excess reserves in the IMF, just like there's the central bank keeps reserves from all the banks, so all the countries maintain accounts in the IMF. And if anybody is running in excess in foreign exchange, there's a tax, so that people try to avoid excesses. And that once you put pressure on the country with export surplus, then problems that of basically see, this was discussed. There's the beggar thy neighbor policy. We can suppose our country is having a recession. One cheap way to get rid of it is to reduce our exchange rate. This will increase our aggregate demand and reduce our demand for imports, but it impacts adversely on the aggregate demand of the other country. So you can so this used to happen. People would, one country would devalue and then the other would do competitive evaluation, and this was a lose-lose situation where everybody you'd end up in the same place as before because of, but in worse off. Both countries would be worse off. Oh. Now, actually, he said that this competitive devaluation are lose-lose, but devaluations can be win-win exactly in the post-war situation. If everybody is simultaneously devalued by a large amount, things would have been much better. So it's possible that but if it's done for different reasons, it can be a lose-lose situation. So, because people attempted to keep exchange rates fixed in the post-war period, this led to disequilibrium, and if devaluation, then you can put quotas, you put capital controls, you have to do a lot of different things to maintain your currency in disequilibrium, and this is what used to happen, and so that's why MMT prefers the floating exchange rate. And then one of the very important things, as I've been mentioning, is the psychology. Everybody is afraid of allowing the countries to float, and there are some genuine problems that will emerge if we allow currencies to float. But if we do allow currencies to float, then the institutional structures will come into existence which will take care of these problems. As it is, because we are preventing floating, so all of the risks that come in from the floating are being borne by the governments. The governments are much better able to bear risks, but what happens is that these risks become multiplied, and so you have 130 banking crises, because ultimately the governments collapse, because the big players in the game have huge amounts of gold and they can even break the Bank of England, so little countries like cannot survive. So the real solution is to prevent speculation. This is not possible. So the other solution is to allow floating. This will transfer the risk to the private sector. Crises will no longer happen, but the private sector will suffer heavily initially, but then they will develop mechanisms to cope with the risk. There are many mechanisms, but for the moment the private sector has been content to let the government take care of this, and we have not allowed them to grow into the floating exchange rate. So this is not a easy solution. The floating exchange rate is a painful solution which requires some time, and it requires that the government nurse the institutions through the period. It should do hand holding, it should provide, it should create the institutions required, and these institutions are not just domestic, we need some international institutions. So a lot of work is required to get the MMT thing to work. In the past, floating exchange rates had not worked very well because the central banks have managed the exchange, and because they have managed the exchange, they have had central banks. Like Pakistan has been on a managed exchange rate, and we have need, if you have true floating exchange, the central bank doesn't need any reserves. But nobody has done that. All over the world, people have maintained reserves because of the fear of floating. Alright, so I think we stop here. Oh, yeah, so I was saying that on Friday at 9 I will try to have